University response to students that positive. We're going to wait a few seconds to get more people to join in, log in, so please bear with us. But momentarily we will introduce ourselves and get started. All right, well, as I see the number going up, I want to go ahead and get started. Again, hello to everyone that is joining in on this call. My name is Lisa Freeman. I am the Director of Residence Life, and I'm here with my colleagues who will introduce themselves, and then we will get right into discussions regarding the university response for residential students that test positive. I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. I'll start with Leanne.
Hi, everyone. Leanne Wright here. I'm the Associate Director of Environmental Health and Safety, and I lead our contact tracing efforts on campus.
Thank you, Leanne. And Paul.
Hello, I am Paul Calhoun, Director of COVID-19 Student Support Services. I am responsible for the isolation housing process, transportation to and from isolation housing, meals, and the overall student experience throughout the isolation housing.
Thank you, Paul. And Jeff.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Jeff Brown. I serve as the Dean of Students here at American University. Our primary role in this capacity is working with students and communicating with their faculty and professors in terms of how these situations impact their academic life here at AU.
Thank you, Paul. So as we go through our discussion today, I will ask, and it was already mentioned in the chat, if you have questions. I know that there were some questions submitted in advance. Thank you for those. But if you do have questions as we're going through this conversation, please feel free to put them in the chat. We will have time at the end to do Q&A and to answer hopefully as many questions as possible. But as we get started, I wanted just to remind everyone that the university instituted a vaccination requirement for all students, faculty, and staff. And as part of this process, we only have a small number of students and faculty and staff that have received medical or religious exemptions to this requirement. Any member that has been granted this exception, in addition to those that have met the vaccination requirements, are expected to adhere to the highest standards for testing as well as quarantining. What's important to note is that the way this works is that we all play a part and we all have a role in ensuring the overall well-being of our community members. To get us started, we're going to have Paul walk us through what happens when we are notified and learn that a student has tested positive. So, Paul.
Thank you, Lisa. American University students register themselves in the Shield T3 app. This cellular device app is used for student check-in at our on-campus testing center, as well as notification about test results. Students who test on campus by way of using the Shield T3 app receive their results within 24 hours of that testing experience. Upon receipt of the test results, our administrative COVID response team is also notified of those results. In the event that a student receives test results late night or very early morning, our COVID response team communicates with them effective 8 a.m. the next business day. In the event that a student tests off campus at a non-AU testing facility, they self-report using a form available through our American University website and portal. In both cases, test results through self-reporting or the Shield T3 app are funneled to the AU COVID response team, inclusive of myself and other professional staff. Conversations began as early as 8 a.m. and as late as 8 p.m. about transportation to isolation housing, as well as the overall isolation housing experience. AU students isolate for at least 10 calendar days. That period can extend if symptoms present or persist or worsen. Students who isolate are told how to prepare, things to pack, such as clothing, personal effects that are essential for them, academic matters such as textbooks, computers, tablets, of course, the charging cables for those items, that all-important cell phone and the charging cable to go along with it, any personal hygiene products or toiletries, and any personal effects that help them feel comfortable, such as a teddy bear, a blanket, or a special pillow. AU students who transport to isolation housing do so by way of a private chauffeur vehicle. The chauffeur picks up students on campus, transport them to the isolation facility. Students enter the isolation facility by way of a private garage entrance. The private elevator is staffed by an AU employee who is on site in the facility 24 hours a day. That employee, along with myself, provide daily check-in to AU students in isolation. These are persons who transition from residential housing spaces to the isolation facility, and many of those students are very unsure about next steps. Those next steps are reiterated daily through phone call, text message, and email message. They include daily check-ins about temperature check, pulse oxygen levels, and any other symptoms, visits with student health center staff if symptoms exist or persist or worsen, daily ordering of meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, which are delivered to the student's isolation space, as well as ensurance that students communicate with faculty members on a consistent basis. Faculty members are notified by our Dean of Students office that students may have a significant health challenge that prevents them from attending class in person. However, faculty members are told to ensure that students do not receive absences as a result of this. Rather, they work one-on-one with students to complete work remotely, electronically, through telephone and/or email, as well as our Canvas platform. Students who experience duress, distress, or unexpected medical symptoms that require emergency attendance work directly with myself, the Student Health Center staff, and emergency personnel. In those cases, the student, as well as emergency contacts, parents, will be notified of my direct contact information and kept abreast throughout the transport process, as well as any subsequent emergency experiences. Overall, students receive daily communication, daily support, and have the opportunity to work with our AU Counseling Center, our Health Promotions and Advocacy Center, and of course, our AU Student Health Center. In the event that an AU student does not test positive, but is exposed to someone who tests positive, that person works with our AU contact tracing team. The contact tracing team maintains daily communication with American University students who do test positive to learn about their activities, people that have been in close contact with them, and to initiate conversations with those close contacts. Leanne Wright leads a team of contact tracing staff, and she's going to speak a bit more about that next step.
Thanks, Paul. So we know that contact tracing is a very important layer of protection that we have in our community. We also know that the faster we can reach people that have tested positive for COVID-19 to conduct that contact tracing, the better, the more effective our contact tracing program is going to be. So in the same way that Paul just indicated, his team is notified of positive individuals or residential students that test positive. Our AU contact tracing team is also automatically notified of positive individuals in the same way. So it can either come through a self-report form through the AU portal. If the individual tested off campus, they're required to fill out that self-report form to notify the university. And the second way being through the AU test site, which majority of our residential cases come through that way, and the lab directly notifies us to our system. So once that is in the system, the next morning, our contact tracing team will start reaching out to any positive cases that day. We typically start making calls around 9:15, 9:20 in the morning. And our contact tracing coordinating team prioritizes phone calls to all of those individuals who tested positive. So those positive individuals can expect that 9 o'clock, 10 a.m. phone call from contact tracing. We make every effort to reach out to those cases right away. So if we aren't able to reach them via phone, we'll leave a voicemail. If that fails, we send an AU emergency alert to this cell phone on file, and we send an email. So it's pretty aggressive as a priority item to get in touch with them. Once we're able to make contact with the positive individual, we have a thorough conversation with them about where they've been. We identify their potential time for when they were infectious, so their infectious period based on their symptom onset date and their positive test date. So we do an interview of what classes they may have attended, social gatherings, etc. So anyone that they interacted with in the AU community, we're asking about. So we had some questions around, are we only asking about class rosters or AU official activity? But we do actually ask about social interactions as well to notify campus members as needed. Once we do that discussion with the case and answer any questions that they might have about isolation expectations, etc., our second notification priority group is notifying those close contacts. So we do see which of close contacts are considered fully vaccinated and which may have an exemption. And we reach out to each of those close contacts to give them what their next steps should be based on their vaccination status. Here's another point of clarification that I want to make for our students that may be considered or identified as close contacts. If you are fully vaccinated, or if your student is fully vaccinated, they do not need to complete a quarantine. That means they're still expected to go to class if they're not experiencing any symptoms, and they still can participate in their AU activities. This is per a DC Health and CDC guidelines for individuals who are fully vaccinated. We know that they have had an exposure, and we still require them to get tested 3 to 5 days after their exposure date. But again, I want to clarify that if they're not experiencing symptoms and they're fully vaccinated, we do expect them to continue attending class and activities as needed. They are not expected to quarantine in their rooms. If they're unvaccinated, we'll have that conversation and they will need to quarantine, and they'll be provided more information from my team and Paul's team about their expectations of how to complete that quarantine in residence. So they will not be moved to an additional dorm. They will stay in their original dorm room to complete their quarantine. Then we do a third layer of communication to the wider campus community of what we call any proximity contacts. So that's maybe someone who was in the same class as the person who tested positive during that person's infectious period. Those individuals we consider kind of the third layer of notification. So those typically will come out later in the afternoon or maybe even the next morning, advising them to please get a test as well 3 to 5 days after they attended that class with that individual. Per DC Health, those individuals are not considered close contacts. So we also, again, are not asking that individuals that attended that class to quarantine or do anything further beyond getting that 3 to 5 day post-class test. And I think that's everything I wanted to say about contact tracing. I'm happy to, speak to all of your students if they have questions. Our contact information is COVID notification at american.edu. And I encourage students to reach out if they have any concerns about a potential exposure or when they should be testing or if they're required to quarantine or not. And I'm going to kick it over to Lisa for some additional information about residential resources.
Thanks, Leanne. So as you see, between all the details Paul provided as well as Leanne, you've already been introduced to several layers of support that the student will have. Not just in conversation, but in helping the student to navigate what the next 10 or so odd days will look like for them as they start to recover from COVID, being tested positive. But in the residence halls, we also have, as you all, many have hopefully met your RAs and community directors, there's another layer of support in the residence halls. While our RAs are not expected to be on the front line of managing any response of COVID, they are there to provide support care and concern for students that are impacted, either through the student that is positive or through the roommate. The RAs are not going to be the person that provides the daily details on what's happening with the student. What we encourage you to do is to make sure that you are maintaining contact with your loved one. And as Paul described, from the moment the student is contacted, they're going to get pretty detailed, both the conversation as well as detailed email that outlines all of the different steps that will be taken, but also the resources that are there. So the RAs are not going to be involved in the student that once the student is transported over to isolation housing, but the residence life team is still a resource. I know I'm on call and I spoke to a parent this weekend, which brings me to our on-call process. So we have an on-call team that operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for emergency and incident management. If there is a student concern or a student need, the on-call team is available to respond. So if there's a student that tests positive, and Paul mentioned that those notifications sometimes come at 2 o'clock in the morning. If a student is unsure of what to do, they certainly can call their RA on duty, who will call the community director on duty, who will then guide them through the basic information that will be coming to them. But the residence life team really is deferring to Paul's contact with that student to ensure that the student is getting consistent and accurate information. With regard to parent engagement, we really do rely on the student to communicate the details that are provided for them. So when that student tests positive, once that student has made contact with Paul's team, they will have a good amount of information that may not all be digestible right in the moment, but it certainly is available. So we encourage you to make sure that you are telling your child to, one, to make sure they're answering their phone, but two, that they're also reading their email, because many of the questions that you have are going to be answered in the communications that we provide for students. Aside from that, our focus is helping that student to recover. Paul described the services and support that will be provided for the students, not an additional fee, but that we are making sure that the student can get the support that they need, the basic needs met, food, making sure that they have access to medical professionals if it is needed, but always will have daily contact with somebody from the university. So having said that, we're going to come to our Q&A portion, but I do want to call your attention. Yesterday, our President Burrows, sent a notification out to our campus community, and they are consistent notifications, but this one specifically provided the community member with details on what is called the COVID-19 dashboard. We have heard from the community members in wanting additional information about how COVID-19 is impacting our community. This dashboard will provide that information. It will include how many students have tested, how many individuals have tested positive within the community, how many have been hospitalized. And that information I know is important to all of us. So the dashboard you can find, there's in the chat function, we provided the link so that you can check in and log into that daily. It will be updated weekly, and that information will be in for the most part real time, but it'll give you a snapshot. And just to give you kind of a sense of what details are, we at this point have had, I believe, 22 cases in a campus community of 17,000. And so that's a small amount in terms of the larger community that is AU. So our commitment is to being transparent and providing as much information to students, family, and loved ones as possible. And even for myself and my colleagues as a campus community, we are also impacted by COVID-19, and we would want to know that detail as well. So we're going to shift now, as I know there are questions, and Karen, thank you. Karen will introduce herself, as I'm sure many of you already know who she is, but Karen will introduce herself and she'll take us through the Q&A portion of our conversation.
Thanks, Lisa. So again, I'm Karen Casella. I've had the chance to meet so many of you, so it's good to see you here on screen. I'm the Director of New Student and Family Programs, and I'm a proud double Eagle. Lisa, I'm going to start with you because we've had some parents asking. One of the pieces of advice we give to students when they have a concern, especially if it's in those off hours, is to talk to their RA or the front desk. Can you just share with this audience the additional steps we've been taking recently to help make sure that those frontline folks are feeling prepared with the information they need?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that question. So just yesterday, we met with our student leaders, our RAs in particular, and we ran through many of the details that we provided with you today. We are going to start to see this ebb and flow of waves that are going to come across our campus. And we've all been over inundated with information about COVID and the response. And so we want to make sure that all of our student staff know the baseline information. We don't expect them to be your primary resource of information, but we do want them to at least know the basic information about notification, about transporting to isolation housing. So we have done that check-in with our teams. We trained them, and now we did a refresher yesterday. There will be some details that will be provided via our website, as well as our 4 Winds, which is a mechanism we use to provide even the details that we've shared today regarding someone and when they test positive, what that process is. So we will continue to provide that information, not just to our student staff, but also to our larger community to make sure that everybody is versed on what the process will be to manage. And I'm also open to feedback. If what I'm saying is not what your student is experiencing, I would want to know that, particularly as it's specific to our residence hall assistants or our desk. But we have provided them with that information so that we can make sure that we are all operating on the same page and on the same understanding.
Great, thanks. Paul, I think this one is going to you. So for our students who are in isolation housing, can you talk a little bit more about the kind of medical support that they're getting? What if they need to access medications, or if the family's interested in some form of treatment, can they come and go? How does this work?
It's a great question. Thank you. AU students in isolation have complete access to the full scope of the Student Health Center staff. The healthcare providers are available for one-on-one appointments through telehealth. Medication needs, prescriptions are provided directly to students as prescribed or as requested. Specifically, it's important that we state everybody has full access to every AU resource, even while they are in isolation space. Their medical care, their health, and their recovery is our #1 priority. So conversations with students begin and end with those discussions in mind.
Excellent, thank you. Jeff, you may have touched on this a little bit, but I think there's a lot of folks who are anxious about what happens with the coursework, right? If we're isolating for 10 days, what are the steps? What are reasonable expectations about how they might work with their faculty to make sure they don't fall behind?
Good question, Karen. So as my colleague Paul had already stated, and just to reiterate, when our office is alerted that a student is in our isolation housing, we do have a set of protocols within the Office of the Dean of Students to alert several people. So once we do receive that, that notification, which is generally first thing in the morning, our office does log that student's situation, and we are sending letters to the student's faculty, to the student's academic advisor, as well as the associate dean within their school. Students will also receive a copy of this. So students, you can rest assured that when you see that notification come to your inbox, it's also in the inbox of the people I just mentioned. That letter is not going to provide any sort of specific medical information, but will alert your faculty that you will be out of class for the period of days that Leanne's staff has identified for us. Faculty are encouraged to work directly with you. This notice provides you an excused absence in the class, but it's important to know that it does not excuse you from the work that is provided. So our faculty have all been given guidance through the schools and our colleges on being flexible with you to make that work up. Certainly, if you are able to do any of that work, in a virtual environment, or keep up with the information or keep up with the coursework identified in your syllabus, that is certainly encouraged. But the key here is really making sure that you as a student are in communication with those faculty members. The faculty have been extremely flexible, and they are aware of the many different situations, not just COVID, but the other situations that our students face on a daily basis. And again, the key is that you as a student are communicating with the faculty to make sure that you are setting up those arrangements to complete the coursework.
Thanks, Jeff. An awful lot of our folks on this presentation today are really curious about the location for our isolation housing. And I understand from my colleagues that we're not at a point where we're disclosing that. But Paul, I'm wondering if you can share with folks a little bit more about the amenities, what people might expect as they shift from their on-campus place to this location, and talk a little bit about the support that's there, and like how are the rooms set up? What kind of access do they have to services?
Absolutely. I was actually typing a chat response to someone at the moment. Our isolation housing experience is an extension of our on-campus housing experience, in that we ensure that everybody feels fully connected to the community, maintaining daily communication with not only myself, but also our student support services staff across the university. Every individual room is outfitted with king-size bed or queen-size bed. There are linens refreshed, made available daily for students. Private bathrooms are inside each room, complete with towels and standard hotel toiletries. In addition, every room's got a mini refrigerator available. We offer refillable beverage containers, glassware. Specifically, we've got a beverage station on every single floor where students are able to have full access to water, ice chips even. Our goal is to replicate as much as possible a healthy space where students can isolate in comfort, in privacy, in a secure area without the worry or bother from outside interferences, and not having to worry about securing food, picking up packages. We take care of that for them, and really having things delivered. Our goal is to make it a painless experience, but also one that we can sort of ensure student safety is a priority. As a result of that, we ensure that students know they are not exiting the isolation space until they receive clearance from our Student Health Center. Parents, friends, family, we ask that you please call, text, email, have virtual communication even, but we ask that you, as much as possible, try to refrain from visiting or accessing the isolation space. The space is not available for people to visit independently or individually. The staff of the hotel have been given strict instructions about managing security for our students. There are secure entrances and exits. Our on-site AU staff have also been given clear instructions about how to best support our students and also respond to needs from family, friends, or guests who may choose to appear but not be able to access our students at that time. I'm going to continue to answer questions in the chat. We can't hear you, Karen.
It's like I've never done this before. It's like you've read our minds here, Paul. I think you answered a number of the questions, especially because certainly when families get those calls, they get anxious and they're ready to come down. Paul, what's the guidance for a family who might want to try to have their student come and isolate with them under their care? Like back at home, maybe they live locally or they have friends. What do we say to this?
That's a great question. Isolation, again, is no additional charge for any AU residential student. It's important that we work one-on-one with the student and the family to talk about what that will look like if someone decides they want to remove the student from AU care, from AU housing, and take them home. But by all means, the conversation is something that we're prepared to have, and also the opportunity is something that we're prepared to support.
Thank you. So another question, I don't know if this goes to Leanne, and I know we've got some folks from the health center in the wings who might be able to help us out with this. But when we're directing those students to get tested, right, if they've been identified through contact tracing, what are the best options if that window falls over the weekend or at a time when the testing center is closed?
Yeah, so typically that 3 to 5 day window post exposure gives us some time. So I, try to remind people the number one thing people tend to do, which I totally understand, is you find out you've been a close contact. Maybe that contact was yesterday, right? I'm immediately want to get a test. That's not necessarily the best course of action to really, if you're not experiencing symptoms, to really try to hold off and wait at least 3 to 5 days from that exposure date to get that test, because we know that a virus doesn't replicate overnight once you've been exposed. It takes some amount of time, typically at least 72 hours, to replicate to a level where it can be picked up on our most sensitive test, which is a PCR test. So I really strongly encourage our students, if they can at all, if they're asymptomatic, to wait and get the AU test. Because it's a PCR test, we are, very confident in the laboratory that we are working with, and we're confident in our process around how those laboratory data are resulted back to the university, and it's a very tight process. And it doesn't require the student to do any other work if they end up testing positive. There are students can choose to test off campus. There are a few things I would want to keep in mind for them. I think we get those rapid tests seem very convenient, but they're not the best tests to get if we're not experiencing symptoms, and they're less sensitive than our PCR tests that we offer on campus. And if you end up testing off campus and you end up getting a positive, you'll have to remember to complete that self-report. So I'm really encouraging and remembering that there's that window of time. If it's a weekend and you're experiencing symptoms, I would encourage you to self-isolate, and we have resources, which we'll share on the FAQ page about some off-campus test sites. DC, the city of DC has some public test sites that I think operate 7 days a week. And then we also, just like the rest of the country, have CVS, Walgreens, et cetera, available for you to get that test in an emergency, as well as some of our urgent care clinics. But again, encouraging any asymptomatic individuals to really wait and get that AU test.
Thanks so much, Leanne. I know we also had a parent pointed out that sometimes the students had gone to go get tested and weren't aware that they shouldn't be drinking or eating before a test. And so just to put that out to the whole group, I've also put in the chat here a link for more details about the testing. It does require a little bit of preparation. Students can also help by downloading the app that we use so that they're ready when they arrive for the testing site and there's fewer surprises. So again, have your students take a look at this link. Thanks, Leanne. Kind of to some of the points you were raising in there, Leanne, about like what happens when a student may be notified outside of AU system, because as far as I understand it, right, the AU system, if they test with AU, then AU gets the notice, right, at the same time the student does. So we're on it. But there may be cases when students have tested off campus and that's how they find out. Lisa, are we finding that most of the students that we're seeing in residence are reporting that if they're not using the AU system? I think there's some chatter on the social medias and we're trying to address what might be myth and what might be reality about whether we're hearing the right way about the cases.
Well, I know, I'll let Paul jump in as well. I think it's about educating the community to make sure. This is one of our attempts, many attempts that we've made to make sure that people understand the process. I mentioned earlier, I was on call this weekend and we had a student that received a positive notification off campus, but he did not know what to do. And so we were able to provide him what that next step would be. The first would be self-reporting. Once that student self-reports, they go in and log that information. It's as if they were on campus and the two get matched and mirrored together, which then Paul receives his notification, Leanne's team receives their notification, and then we start that process that was described in the beginning. But what's important, if you're a parent or a family member on this call and you have a loved one, make sure that they know if they receive a notification off campus that it's their responsibility to self-report, basically make the university made aware of their positive case. And then from there, all the things we described will be activated. And that's a message that I'll make sure that the RAs continuously are reminding students as well. And like I said, we'll have some additional literature that we put out that will include that as well, because we need everyone to do their part in doing that.
Thank you. So our standard for isolation is 10 days, right, Paul? Is there a procedure or an option if a student were somehow to test negative within that 10-day window? Can they then return to campus? Or are we staying with the 10 days? Can we talk a little bit about this? Leanne, I see you shaking your head too. Jump in.
Absolutely. Leanne is best able to answer that question for us.
So DC Health and CDC guideline is once you've received a positive test, you actually should not test again for 90 days. You're exempt from any testing. And the reason we typically see or that they recommend that is because you will, or very likely if you test positive, to continue testing positive beyond that window when you're considered infectious. So you'll still potentially have that viral or RNA in your respiratory system, but in a way that is not actually able to be transmitted to others at that time. So it can actually be kind of frustrating if you continue testing and getting a positive result. And basing that, your isolation might end up being much longer than actually scientifically warranted. So I would find it unlikely that you would subsequently get a negative if you got a positive on a PCR initially, because they're very sensitive and very specific tests. And we don't require a negative test to be cleared from isolation for that reason. It's really that calculation of 10-day. And DC Health, I will add, is very strict about a positive is a positive test. So we sometimes get questions of if we have an asymptomatic individual who tests positive, it can be very kind of concerning for them. And we've had concerns over like if it's a false positive. And really DC Health's epidemiology team, which we make every decision hand in hand and in tandem with them, is very strict about positive is a positive.
Thanks, Leanne. That's so helpful. I'm not going to let you go. Can you just help this audience understand a little bit more the difference in terminology? Because we used to talk about quarantine. Now we're talking about isolation. Can you explain the difference?
Yes. So isolation, they get cross-wired. It gets a little confusing once in a while to make sure we're all talking on the same page. So isolation is referred to when an individual tests positive and has to stay away from others because they have a confirmed COVID-19 case. COVID-19 infection. So an active infection, we think of that as isolation. And in that case, that is where Paul's group is triggered to come in and help the student move to isolation housing because a confirmed positive test. And then we have anyone that is a close contact who may need to quarantine, which they are staying in their original residence hall and just trying to stay away from others at that point. They don't have a confirmed infection, but they're kind of on standby, on high alert, I would say, to get that 3 to 5 day post-exposure test to see if that they end up testing positive. So we're just trying to keep them away from others in case they become infectious so that they don't have an opportunity to infect other people in quarantine. If that, I think, hopefully clarifies it. So isolation is for positive individuals, quarantine is for those who have been exposed.
Gotcha. And just to be clear, right? If a student has been notified with that letter from your office that says they were in contact, they are still able to go to class, right? And they can still go about their daily life. We recommend that they get tested, right?
If they are fully vaccinated. So yes, more likely than not, right? Or 99% of our residential students are fully vaccinated. So 99% chance that when I trace that student, they're going to be fully vaccinated and we're going to say no need to quarantine unless you have symptoms, in which case you're going to self-isolate and get that test. And the 1% chance that they have some type of medical exemption, we'll walk through what that quarantine will look like for them.
Thank you. Paul, I'm bouncing back to you, the man of the hour. What if a student has some specific dietary needs or restrictions? What kind of supports do we have in place?
A wonderful question. The restaurant vendor for the hotel is able to work with students who've got vegan, vegetarian, kosher, or even some other special unique dietary needs. We are so grateful to have a phenomenal dining services team, including a dietitian, who work directly with myself as well as our isolation facility to ensure menus are available. Students can choose options that are not only healthy, but also enjoyable for them and really tasty.
Thanks for that important anecdote there. Paul, and more for you. How long do we think it routinely would take between a student being notified of their status and being able to be transported? And since we've told them we don't want them to leave their room, like what kind of interim supports can we expect, right? So that they're not finding out at 8 and then not having access to food until the end of the day.
That's a great question. Lisa referenced earlier the importance of our great residence life team. So our resident assistants, our community directors, even our on-call staff who work nights and weekends, we all work together as one team to ensure students know that we're available, we're accessible, and we're going to transport them as soon as possible, within reason. We do not transport before 8 a.m. on any morning. We do not transport after 8 p.m. on any evening. However, we transport every day of the week. So please rest assured, students, parents, as soon as we learn about a positive test result, we begin to work, myself and the student, on their transportation plan and isolation plan. We ask the students allow at least a 3-hour window in order for us to secure the chauffeur who will transfer them, as well as to allow time for them to prepare, pack, to allow time for us to communicate with their faculty, allowing time for us to incorporate our student health center staff for health assessments, and to ensure that everything is in place for a smooth transition at that facility.
Thanks. So in a number of the cases that we've been working with, I know, Paul, you've spent a lot of time talking to those family members of those affected students. And so is it fair to say that you think you would continue to be able to work with those students when they're in isolation housing? But I mean, I think we've got questions about and concerns. What happens if a student's medical condition deteriorates? Should parents expect that we're going to call them in those instances? Like, how do we coordinate that care?
Absolutely. I'm happy I'm able to state this again. The minute that we learn about symptoms changing or worsening, we initiate emergency protocol. And that sounds really scary, but it simply means that we ensure that our daily communication includes more people. I ensure that students know that I want to communicate with their emergency contact, be it a family member, a close friend or relative, maybe even a neighbor. I ensure that those persons have my contact information and that they understand the next steps that we're going to take. Then we work with our emergency services personnel, our EMTs, EMS. We make the call on behalf of our student. Our staff travel with the student downstairs to receive or be received by the ambulance. At that moment, students are assessed, their vitals are taken, and this is really important to share. Students are considered adults, and so they are even then given a chance to decide if they want to be transported. So it's important that we have a conversation with our students about their health and about the choices that they make regarding emergency care. In the event that somebody identifies a need to have emergency care, I contact the emergency contact. Even if the student decides they do not want to transport, I notify the emergency contact. Our institution takes emergency care and really all health matters extremely important. I pause for a moment because I just want to ensure that we all hear this clearly. We take this seriously. We take emergency care seriously. We take COVID-19 concerns seriously. And I've got to admit, I take the isolation housing experience very seriously. So as much as you all have questions, concerns, please know that we want to answer them. And if you have or seek to reach out to myself or my team, know that we may not be available immediately to respond to you, but the other persons on the call today are probably able to help out in the event that you can't directly reach me. My time and my team's time is dedicated to persons who are in isolation or transitioning to isolation for sure.
Thanks, Paul. Leanne, I'm going to bounce back to you. It's another chance to sort of reemphasize these points. When a student receives that letter from your team that says we want them to test, we're expecting them to test, right? That's the expectation. And then are we considering them like kind of all clear once they've tested negative?
So if they're fully vaccinated and are not required to quarantine and they continue to not have symptoms, right? If at any time anyone has a suspect COVID-19 symptom, please get another test. No one's going to say you're getting too many tests because you thought you had you just got one 3 days ago because you were a close contact. Now you have symptoms, please get another test. But yes, so following the directive in the email will go many far lengths for you to stay out of student conduct because it is part of our directives and you are required to cooperate with anything that contact tracing team is requesting that you do, including testing. If you are not vaccinated and you are required to test, and so you have to quarantine, you still have to get a 3 to 5 day post-exposure test, but that quarantine still lasts 10 days. So it doesn't clear you if you're in quarantine, but you are more or less cleared after the 3 to 5 days if you're vaccinated. You are requested to really pay extra close attention if you're fully vaccinated to any symptom onset that you have for 2 weeks. But all those directions, again, it's a lot of information. That's why we have contact tracing, to guide each person through in the event that they need to be guided through some process. While I like to have transparency around the process and answer questions about it, sometimes it's just, I think, easier for us to take it one step at a time.
Thanks, Leanne. Lisa, I'm going to turn back to you. I think that there's a lot of folks who are concerned about sort of the general feeling in the halls, whether students are feeling a heightened sense of anxiety around this, what we're finding when a roommate discovers that their roommate has tested positive. If you could just speak a little to what residential life is feeling like.
Sure, it's an important question, and I appreciate that it's being asked. You know, I think you're right. It's a scary time for any and all of us, specifically to think about someone being impacted by this virus. What we train our RAs in training is, you know, how to navigate roommate conflicts, how to have difficult conversations, encourage roommates to be open with each other about what they're experiencing. And also, you know, and I said this earlier when we got started, the way this works is if the community all does their part. And so it means sometimes having those difficult conversations. If a roommate, you know, has another roommate and they're positive and they're not really sure how to go about it, their best line of defense is to contact their RA. But if they want to deal with, you know, an older person, an adult, if you will, even though we know these are all adults, you know, our community directors these are master's level professionals that live in the residence halls that, you know, they're in this field because of this, to be that support and resource for students. Some of the details that Paul provided, at the core of it, we want to be a community of care. Many of you all of you all just recently said goodbye and parted ways, and you met many of us as we volunteered and assisted you with your move-in. And we hope that we relayed that message that we're here to be a support. And that support is going to look different for each individual. I know for those having students that are first time away from home, and for some it's long distances, there probably is going to be a heightened level of anxiety. We want to do whatever we can to provide that support. So if you can't get that support through conversation with the RA, the community directors are there. We also have a leadership team and even myself that will make ourselves available. We have an on-call system that operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we had that not because of COVID. That's the structure in which we've designed our ability to respond to concerns. And sometimes those concerns can be roommate issues. I'll tell you this weekend, we had to respond to a concern about roommates. And so we're there to be a resource however we can. But what we want you to hear from us is that there are people that are available to respond to and to provide the support that's needed. But what we expect from the roommates is to be open and honest with each other, to talk through what they need from each other, and to ensure that everybody is practicing the highest level of safety. Students are required to wear masks in any indoor facility. That's actually true for faculty and staff, all of us. And we're a campus of 99% vaccination. All of us have to adhere and comply to the guidelines for this to work. But when we do have a positive case, we want to reiterate the importance of knowing that there is support, either through student to student or professional staff to student.
Thank you, Lisa. Leanne, this might be back at you. But if somebody else in the team wants to jump in, by all means. So as of this time, we are not moving to surveillance testing. And there's a lot of folks with questions about this because we're seeing that played out in other settings. Can somebody on the panel speak a little bit to why we're not doing surveillance testing at this time?
Yeah, so I think the number one indicator for why in residence we are not doing mandatory surveillance testing is our 99% vaccination rate. So, CDC guidance really pushes that go ahead and do diagnostic testing for symptomatic individuals who are fully vaccinated, but is much more mushy on the need to require surveillance testing for fully vaccinated individuals, even with the acknowledgement of, we know Delta is here, we know we will see some level of breakthrough infections. But I also want to point out that our positivity rate for our campus community is much, much lower than DC's overall positivity rate. So I feel very confident that we're still in a very good place in terms of our testing and our positivity rate. And if, things with COVID change, if guidelines change, the university is definitely receptive to go ahead and update our mandates once again around testing, et cetera. We also felt that having our testing and resources really targeted at anyone that may have been in proximity to an individual that tested positive, to really have those testing resources, et cetera, going to those populations. So just last week alone, we, I think, administered over 2,000 tests in our campus community, and that's without having a mandate. We're strongly encouraging all of our faculty, staff, and students vaccinated to still go ahead and get that surveillance test once a week. Anyone with an exemption is still required to test twice a week. And so I think between, those proximal contact notifications that we're sending people to that they have to get a test 3 to 5 days after that classroom or proximal contact with an individual, any close contacts that we're sending that requirement to, and anyone with symptoms, we really are still just taking a targeted approach at who we're pushing to please get tested.
Thank you, Leanne. We have just a few minutes left for our last questions, but I've seen a few that have come up in the chat. And I just want to speak a little bit to this with families who are looking for, who do we contact? So families, we're all doing the very best we can over here. And what I want to stress is that our first priority is to work with your student to make sure that they have the information that they need to move through university life this fall safely. So your students are receiving that information from us directly with the clearest instructions that we can offer. And so we're not going to be able to fill in other blanks for you. That is the starting point. So I'm going to ask that we take a deep breath, review the content with your student. We've got some more resources online, and we know that there are more questions. Some of us are hearing from a lot of families, and some families are calling a lot of offices. And it doesn't help us move forward or respond to you quicker. In fact, then it means I have to call Lisa and Paul and Jeff to find out which one of us has the update to respond. So I know this requires a lot of patience and grace, but I'm going to ask for you to take a deep breath, choose one of us to reach out to. Most of you know you can catch me at auparent@american.edu. And sometimes we're going to refer you to the resources we already have readily available online. If your student is directly affected, we're going to communicate with your student. And then if your student is working with Paul, then there's more opportunities to work with Paul on those. And I realize that's a leap of faith, but we're going to figure this out together. I think as Leanne has shown and we've seen on the dashboard, this is a very large campus community and our rates have been very successful so far. So we're going to continue to do what we can, and we're all learning how to do this safer throughout this whole challenging time. But it's promising, and we are seeing students as we walk across campus. I think all of us can say that we're seeing students remarkably well with the mask mandates and the distancing, so that's been great. I also want to address another thing that some have raised, which is whether classes are going to be converting to online. That is not the plan. It has not been the plan, and we remain committed to that. There have been some instances that some of you have heard of where students at classes, individual course sections or individual class meetings may from time to time opt to be conducted online. Consider this, we're not allowing guests to come to campus. So the only way for faculty to have those guest speakers that we all love here at AU appear is when that class is conducted online. And so faculty are perfectly enabled from time to time to make those adjustments. There may have been some recent adjustments as some of our faculty colleagues have been granted accommodations due to their health and safety conditions to conduct class online. But these are the rare instances. There are thousands of classes and sections here on campus, and a handful have made some recent changes. So please, when we hear that class is moving online, let's take a pause. There's lots of reasons those things can happen. It doesn't mean that the university is changing its operational plan. So with that, let me take a peek and see if there's anything else that's come in. But Lisa, did you have any closing thoughts or advisement?
No, I hope that we've answered some questions. We may not have answered all, but hopefully we clarified that there has been an enormous amount of work put into the response. I will tell you that AU, we've learned a lot in the 18 months when we were first all impacted by this virus. And I can say with 100% confidence and assurance that there is a team. This is a village. It takes a village. I say that all the time to students, and I say it to families. And this village has worked hard to ensure that we can continue to maintain the care that you've entrusted us to provide to your student and your loved one. I ask that you, as Karen said, to continue to have that trust in us, that we are responding, that we are supporting, and that we are providing the resources that are needed. But in the event that there was something that maybe didn't go as planned, I offer myself as a resource. Please reach out and we'll get answers to your questions. But we do need you to trust in the village. I know this is new, it's a new relationship for us, but hopefully you'll see in time and in our interactions and in decisions that we are delivering on that promise to be there to care, to provide concern, and to see each student, regardless of COVID or any other factor, should still be allowed to flourish and to thrive while at AU. And we're excited that you made AU your choice, and we want to continue to make this a home for each and every one of you. So thank you all for joining this call. This has been recorded, so this information will be shared out. But we hope that we've at least provided you with some more details that will help you feel a bit more comforted in our process and in our response.